So I just pull them from the top. Sometimes the soil comes with them, sometimes it doesn't, but we don't really need. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having an awesome day. It is a windy November 21st here in South Georgia, but it's time to get our onions in the ground. So today, as we plant our onions, I'm going to tell you about 6 common mistakes to avoid when planting and growing onions. But before we go out to the garden, let's check on our onion plants here in the greenhouse. And you may recall back in September when we started our onion seeds in the greenhouse here, we did that in several different containers because we wanted to show people that anyone can grow their own onion plants. Whether you have a greenhouse, whether you're doing it inside, whether you have a nice seed starting tray, or whether you just have some small pots. So here we have some onion plants growing in a more traditional seed starting tray with individual cells. We've got some onion plants growing in 2.5-inch pots. We've got some onion plants growing in these larger round pots, just some cheap ones we got from the dollar store. And then we also have some growing in a bottom tray here. Now, if we compare all those, just looking at the color of the plant, seeds here in the more traditional seed starting tray probably look a little bit better, and that's because this tray drains so well. Those in the 2.5-inch pot there may be a little bit overcrowded, but we could certainly still use those onion plants. Those are more than viable. Now, these over here in the round pots in the bottom tray, I didn't drill holes in the bottom of those round pots or the bottom tray. I probably could have grown a better onion plant had I done that, but I just wanted to show you how easy it is to grow your own onion plants, even if you don't have a lot of fancy equipment. So these plants aren't as green as we'd want them to be, but they're nice and thickened up, and we could certainly put these in the ground. So like I told you before, you can grow onion plants anywhere in any kind of container. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. So I'm going to plant those onion plants that we grew out in the seed starting tray with the individual cells, but I'm probably not going to lug that whole tray out to the garden there. Just to make things a little bit easier, I think I'm going to go ahead and pluck my plants out in here and put them in individual containers per each variety, just to make things a little bit easier later when we get out to the garden. Alright, so that should be enough for what I'm going to plant today. I've got each variety in its own container with its own label. Now we'll plant these in the garden in alphabetical order. That way we can keep up with things, but the label will help us until we get out there to the garden. Now, as far as getting these things out of the trays, you can push up the little root ball from the bottom of the trays there and really finesse them out of there if you want to. I find it's really not necessary. You can be a little rough with onion plants. So I just pull them from the top. Sometimes the soil comes with them, sometimes it doesn't, but we don't really need the soil when planting onions, not like planting a tomato where we want to keep that soil and root ball intact. So some of these are kind of bare, some of them have a little bit of soil hanging on. Alright, so now let's walk out to the garden plot where we're going to be putting these. I'll show you how I've got things set up, and then we'll talk about those common onion planting and growing mistakes. So we're going to be putting our onions right here in this no-till plot where we also have our Louisiana evergreen shallots over there looking really good, and we have our garlic just starting to pop out of the soil. So I had this much space to work with, and I knew I wanted to plant 4 rows of onions, so I just eyeballed it and tried to get these 4 rows as equidistant as possible. Row spacing with onions is not that important. But what is important is how we prep those rows to plant our onions. So we used our FAD system, which we use on a lot of things around here. We made a furrow, we amended that furrow with some granular balanced organic fertilizer, and then put our drip tape in the furrow. So now I'm back over here where it's not quite so windy and you'll actually be able to hear me. Let's get into these 6 common onion mistakes you want to avoid. So mistake number 1 is choosing the wrong type of onion to grow. Onions are day length sensitive, which means you have to grow the right type for your area, whether that be long day, intermediate day, or short day. Down here in the deep south, we grow short day onions. All 5 of those varieties that I plucked out of the tray earlier, those varieties we have on our site are short day varieties. So you've got to pick the right type for your region, and if you're on the border between 2 types, you could probably try either one, experiment, see which one does better for you. You might even find that you want to grow both and you would harvest one before you would the other, maybe have a nice little succession there. Mistake number 2 is planting onions too late. Because onions are day length sensitive, they're going to start bulbing when the days reach a certain length. If you plant too late, they're not going to have much time to grow before they start bulbing, and you're going to end up with smaller onions. Now, if you're in the short day growing region and you rarely get below 20 degrees during the winter, you can overwinter your onions like we do, plant in November and then harvest in May. If you're getting down below 20 on a regular basis, the onion plants probably aren't going to like that, and you probably should wait until late winter. Now, I have in the past planted onions as late as December, maybe even early January one year, and we still made some okay onions, but not the big onions that we usually make if we plant in November. So if you haven't already, experiment with some different planting times in your area. Push the limits a little bit. Just keep in mind that general 20-degree rule. The earlier you plant, as long as they're not getting killed by the cold, generally the bigger the onion you'll make. And then mistake number 3 is planting onions too deep. I see this all the time. You really don't have to plant these things very deep at all. On these little babies right here, you see that white part there that's blanched a little bit. Don't want to plant them very far above that. So these right here maybe only get planted 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep, not very deep at all. As onions start to bulb, that bulb wants to emerge from the soil. So if we plant them too deep, they're going to have a harder time doing that. So aim or err on the shallow end of things as you're planting your onions. Don't plant them too deep. Mistake number 4 is not giving onions enough water. Even though we're growing them through the winter down here and the soil tends to stay more moist and doesn't get dried out a whole lot because it's not so hot, we still have to give onions plenty of water for optimal performance. So don't let the seasons fool you. Give them enough water. That's why we use the drip tape. That tape we use has a 6-inch emitter spacing, and we can put down a lot of water to keep those onions happy. Mistake number 5 is not feeding them enough. Onions are very heavy feeders. If you want to grow nice big onions, you have to feed them well. I won't say it's impossible, because anything's possible, but it's dang near impossible to over fertilize onions. So my feeding program for onions is pretty simple. We put down that balanced organic fertilizer at planting. Once they start growing a little bit after transplanting, I'll give them another round of balanced fertilizer, maybe some of that AgriThrive just poured alongside the row there. And then once they really start putting on some growth, say they get, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 inches tall, then we'll just hit them with straight nitrogen, usually every 3 to 4 weeks until they start bulbing. And then lastly, onion mistake number 6 is letting the weeds get out of hand. Onions are one of those plants that don't really like a lot of weed competition, so you really got to stay on top of things early. As you get a lot of that onion foliage developing, especially if you've got your onions planted relatively close, it can be tough to get in there and weed without disturbing the plant so much. So you really got to be on top of things when those onion plants are small. Don't let the weeds get the best of you, and it will make things a lot easier down the road, also help you grow much bigger onions. So I'm going to get busy planting here. Going to start out with this DP Sweet variety, which I have grown close to a 3-pound onion with in the past. And for these plugs that have multiple plants, I'll just gently tease those apart there, trying to leave the roots intact. And I think I'm going to plant just right on top of this tape here. Remember, you don't want to plant these things too deep. We'll just kind of firm up the soil around the plant like that. You can plant on both sides of the tape and do a double row. You can plant these on a 30-inch bed. Lots of different ways to do this. As far as plant spacing goes, I don't think you really want to put them any closer than 6 inches apart if you're planning on growing big onions. Now, in the past, I have planted mine about 4 inches apart, then I'll go thin out every other one, harvest those as green onions and leave the rest to get big. But, you know, if you're going to grow big onions, give them at least 6 inches of space between plants. So I'm going to get these 4 rows knocked out real quick like here, and then I'll show you what it looks like. And there we go. We got them all in, all 4 rows. And these things should do pretty well considering the cool weather we're expected to get over the next week or so. I have planted onions when it was still a little bit warm in November, and sometimes they struggle a little bit, but these should do great with this cooler weather coming. And speaking of cooler weather, my hands are about to freeze out here, so that's going to be all for today. As I mentioned earlier, you can find those varieties that we planted in our garden on our website at lazydogfarm.com. And if you want to see how we planted those onion seeds in those different containers to grow our own onion plants, watch this video right here. We'll break it down step by step and show you how you can grow your own onion plants. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.